Sorry about the interruption to this recording, hence why you have part two. I had to deal with a certain issue, but anyway, back to the point. The bottom line on slide 5 says, can it be checked by others? And essentially that's all you need to know. So if you wanted to find out whether or how someone got a certain amount of information or where they got their information from, you would actually look at their methods. So what did they do to get the information? And that should be transparent. There should be steps to follow that you could indicate and verify that information along every step of that methodology. The actual fourth question, which is the source of the information objective, and we would call it the objectivity test, is a little bit more obtuse. It's a little bit more obscure in the sense that it's not always easy to work out whether there is an active bias in someone's position in terms of how they present their material. However, there are things we can look at directly. So if a certain amount of research is being done in an area, we try and find out where the sources of money or funding come from to actually support that research. What this might mean is that there's commercial enterprises behind it. They're actually funding scientists, for instance, to actually look into a particular product. And what this obviously creates a certain level of questioning around what the findings are, how they'll be presented, particularly if it has commercial value to the people who have funded the actual research. Now, to give an example of this, the tobacco companies, certainly during the 1940s, 50s and 60s and even onwards, funded scientists to look into the health implications of smoking on obviously the general public. What several researchers found quite quickly in terms of the research, a whole range of health problems that were fairly obvious and indicative of smoking. The tobacco companies, because they funded the research, ended up either closing down the research bodies if the findings were negative, which inevitably they always were, and they actually destroyed evidence to suggest that smoking actually produced cancerous cells. They also decided, based on their commercial interests, to actually hush the research up. So they would often either secretly destroy evidence, any evidence, be it laboratory findings, lab books, etc., or would simply put out a smokescreen, as they called it, to use a bad pun, to conceal the facts of the research. Funding can also mean and indicate that it's actually a fairly positive thing, in the sense that if the government is funding something, generally it's neutral, depending on whether it has any sort of political implications. From my experience in England, there were certain reports done, for instance, on poverty, and it was quickly discovered that there are links between poor life in terms of longevity, etc. So and morbidity and mortality rates, etc. So basically, if you were poor or poorer than most, you're more likely to actually die younger and suffer longer with health problems. For obvious reasons, both parties avoided this avoided the findings of this, I should say, only because it would have meant structural change in British society, which would have cost the government a lot of money, would have been very unpopular with the middle class and upper class. So these reports, which were extensive and done over long periods of time, were simply shelved by both governments. And I should say that both governments at different times commissioned these reports, found the same results in the space of 20 years, and nothing was done about it. They were simply shelved on political grounds. The question of bias is an interesting one, because personally you might have some investment in producing some positive results. I mean, to use I guess the more cynical sort of example would be if a researcher is trying to actually discover something new or something novel, and knows that there'll be some kudos, possibly some financial gain by producing certain results, then perhaps it's in their interest to fabricate or falsify certain amounts of data, certain information they have, and present it in a way that makes it look more positive in terms of their case. Also, like I said, the last point would be about purpose. Why are people doing what they're doing? So if research is being carried out, what are the final ends? We only have to ask, what's the objectives? What's the end point here? What do people gain from this particular thing? And I don't mean any of this in a cynical way. I mean, there obviously is examples that do create a certain level of cynicism. However, for me personally, I'd like to believe rather naively that at least research that's being done through universities and possibly done through the government actually has positive outcomes for all of us. Now, the last question we have to consider is the information up to date? We would call it the currency test. Given how quickly information changes over time, and I've certainly noticed in the last 20 years, the relevance of material is quite debatable. If you look at old modes of publishing, for instance, when a lot of people publish their material through books, by the time it actually reaches the publisher and gets on the book stands, the information is usually at least two and a half years old. Now, whether you consider that to be out of date or not is a moot point, but society changes a lot, and I think our world changes a lot, where actually the currency test is quite relevant. I should argue, though, that for me, just because it's up to date doesn't necessarily mean that older information should be obfuscated. In other words, that it should be negated or ignored. I think we do that at our own peril. I think we have to consider the past. I think we need to actually consider information that's come through, different means or methodologies, even if they're somewhat out of date. The point is, though, that we have to consider more contemporary information because it may highlight errors or flaws in past information, but also may throw light on something in a new or novel way, and this is important. I think the last point on the slide, do ideas stand the test of time? I think that's a key measure. If we can actually look at something that's been written 25 years ago, be it a theory, be it just an idea, I personally believe that in the intervening time it's gone under a lot of scrutiny, particularly if it's in the academic world, gone under a lot of scrutiny. If it still has some sort of standing, then it is relevant. It has a certain level of currency, even if it is 25 years old. Having explored the 5 questions, I want to move to slide 8, which discusses what I would consider to be probably one of the most important things in this whole lecture is reliable information true? That question within itself is difficult to answer. And the reason it's difficult is because the truth is hard to define. What is the truth of anything? And I've certainly over the course of my life become less certain about truths. I mean, maybe I'm postmodernist in that sense, that there are no universalities, there's no certainties. In fact, the only certainty is uncertainty. And I don't have problems with that. In fact, I feel quite liberated by it. Even though universals give us structure and they give us purpose, perhaps, they don't always create a better society. I have issues around politics and around religion in that sense. But anyway, that's a personal point of view. Anyway, getting back to the point, truth is hard to define, and I think the truth's all relative to all of us at different points and different contexts in our lives. Even circumstances drive, different interpretations of the truth. And I think we all know this subjectively. However, more in terms of the 5 questions we've just looked at, if information passes the 5 tests, then you would probably suggest that it is reliable. At best, it might be provisional, but you would contend that it's fairly reliable. The only issue, and it's the final point on the slide, which again kind of creates a certain question marks in my mind, is that if we can arrive at different conclusions from the same material, what is the truth of that material? Or does it have multiple truths and it's okay to have those truths? Now, again, drawing from my personal experience, when I started university, I had, a certain worldview that was fairly, I wouldn't say concrete, but was fairly well established, and found very quickly that I had to dismantle it and try and contend with a whole lot of competing truths. I was studying history and studies in religion and sociology at the time. And for me, all had very different perspectives and very different worldviews. Now, within that, I had to somehow find or navigate a path to a place where I felt comfortable, and what I quickly realised that it was okay to have multiple views of the world, even though they might be competing, contending for a centre, that nothing or no one had to have that centre. So in other words, I had a certain flexibility with the truth. This may be different from you, and your experience will change over time, but for me, as I gained more knowledge, I seemed to understand less. I seemed less certain about things, only because, you know, there was, as I said before, there's so many competing stances about the same thing. And I suppose to kind of make some sort of final point, if there needs to be one, is that there's actually no right and wrong. I mean, a whole lot of things can be right, and that's okay. The upshot of all this is that we get to kind of slide 10 and 11, and we look at, you know, where we can principally find reliable information. Now, of course, I have to promote UTAS Library, which I would because it's a great site. Of course, UTAS is fantastic to work at. But having said that, and believing it, you'll see that there's a comparison between publicly accessible web resources and our library resources. Now, me personally, and I've said this before, why would you look anywhere else other than a library? You've got a ready source there that accesses a whole range of journals and so on. And if that's the case, why would you bother trawling through material, trying to find reliable material, when in fact you've got something that's already filtered a lot of the dross out to begin with? So the message here is just use the library. On more sort of tangential things, I want you, if you can, and if you've got the time, etc., to have a look at the exercise on slide 13. It actually gives you this, you know, hypothetical, essay topic that you have to examine. There's a bunch of resources on Milo that you have to look at and measure whether you think that out of the 5 resources that I've submitted there, whether they're reliable or not, and whether you could actually use them in answer to that question. Also, if you can, you know, here I am adding to your woes, do the reading, which is the baloney detection on Milo. That's an article I've put up there. There's lots of other stuff on there. I'm just hoping you get time to at least run through some of these things and put some material up on the discussion board. Anyway, I've said too much. I hope you have a great week. Crack on with assignment 2. It's critical you get it in, obviously, on the 15th. If you have any questions, obviously talk to Julie, as I said right at the start of this recording. For me, like I said, I'm looking forward to actually getting some work back from you that actually involves you taking a position and an opinion. Anyway, good luck everyone. Have a great week. See you later.